a slight detour into the realms of neuroscience and brain science, in order to make a very powerful point, and also to explain why it is that people become God. Okay. That is actually my brain. It's I tell you, when I got that first picture through the lady who made these pictures for me, the first one I got, when I got the first one through in an email attachment, it really sent shivers down the back of my neck. It really was like one of those moments. My God, it's my brain. It's like life is cheap for some. I used to sell my body to medical science as a guinea pig to the IOP Institute of Psychiatry down in Denmark Hill. You get paid money for doing these experiments. And the more dangerous the experiment, the more money you get. I mean, the experiment I did to get these pictures was simple. I just went to a scanner and I listened to the music, and I was told to rate the music on sad or happy. That's what I had to do basically, half an hour in the scanner. And I got 70 quid or something. So some of them are dangerous. You get kind of £2,000, get £2,000 for doing a medical experiment with a guinea pig where they do a spinal tap on you. They take out some like cerebral spinal fluid in the back of your spine. They have to sign just kind of like a contract. You have to say, because there's a 1 in 10,000 chance that they could sever your spinal cord and you become paralysed from the waist down. They get £2,000 for that. Well, I never did that. God, that's like, whoa, Russian roulette. Life never got that cheap. But there was one experiment they did, which I really was fascinated with, which was testing a memory drug. And what I wanted to do was to boost the memory of schizophrenics. So they gave you one drug to make you slightly schizophrenic, and they gave you another drug to boost your memory. No, because they had to do a placebo, because they couldn't tell you what it was because it's double blind. So you went in for 3 sessions and you didn't know what's happening. You didn't know whether to give the placebo, the schizophrenic drug, or whether they gave the memory drug or not. So the first visit, basically, it's pretty standard. What was on the scanner, and you're on the scanner, you just mirror it, you can see the computer screen, you've got a little mouse, and you answer questions, you click on the mouse, and you do these tests. The first one, it was pretty good. It was like no mishaps. The second one was, I felt slightly groggy. I felt slightly, maybe it's something I ate earlier on in the day. I don't know whether it was the schizophrenic drug or not. On the third occasion, I was in the scanner and I was thinking, geez, my memory's pretty good, but not this good. It's got like 100 objects on the screen, like bang, 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 got them all correct in the space of 5 seconds, memorised what they were, exact locations. I thought, gosh, my memory's working well today. I thought, this is like, this is probably the memory drug. And I was kind of happily playing away at this computer game, kind of answering all these memory questions. It was amazing, really kind of like flashing 25 objects in front of my eyes for half a second and memorised everything. Every last detail. Something's happening here. I'm not normally this sharp. But then something started happening. I felt like tingling in my hands. The drug was fed through a catheter. You had to have this kind of thing in your vein. So they took blood samples every half hour or so. And they fed the drug continuously while you were on the scanner. And then I started tingling. And I started hyperventilating. I was feeling slightly nauseous. I was still playing the game. And suddenly I realised, oh my God, this is not so good. My body's feeling slightly sick. I'm feeling slightly sick. So the intercom system, I was kind of going, hey doctors, I'm feeling slightly sick here. I'm feeling like a bit nauseous. I'm feeling a bit like I'm feeling really bad. And I could hear the panic in the voices. They're saying, oh my God, get me out of there, get me out of there. And I was thinking, Jesus, I'm in a room full of doctors. It's okay, I'm perfectly safe. They care about me. So they scrambled to get me out the scanner. And Jesus, I thought, good doctors, Hippocratic oath, they care about me. Gosh, I'm in safe hands. Then I realised what's happening. They're going, my God, our scanner, it's safe. We don't care about you. Our scanner, our $2 million scanner. It's safe. Okay, didn't actually say that, but in their actions, that's what they're kind of saying. Well, I don't care. They paid me, I don't care. The sickness is transient. I mean, really, sure. It's all right. I got a taxi fare home. So they did care. I got a taxi fare home if I wasn't sick. But anyway, so I got this. So these new adventures in medical science. I got these kind of like brain scans. Now I'm going to do a kind of whirlwind tour of neuroscience to show a very profound truth about the brain and what's going on in the brain, how it relates to mystical truths. A very lightning tour. Now, this part of the talk, really, it's where a picture is worth 1,000 words. So, we've got lots of pictures, so you make the equivalent of many thousand words.
I have to say the second row on the left is a bit Darth Vader-ish, isn't it?
It does, yeah, it does. I mean, this one. Yeah, it's kind of like, that's my eye socket. Scan through, yeah. But it's, that's a bit of a bad eye socket though, a little better on other days, you know. Okay, so basically, lightning tour of brain science to explain a very profound truth about the brain and why does it people become God and what's happening in our lives and what's in our minds. Okay, so that's the classical view of the brain. Okay, kind of like this is going to be kind of like a condensed course on how the brain works in the space of 10 minutes or so. That's your classic view of the brain, very convoluted. Now, what a brain actually is, the architecture of the brain, it's like a sheet. All the computations going on in these kind of flat sheets. So if you're kind of the crinkly brain, if you take out all the fibres, you can actually flatten out the brain. It's like a sheet. And that's where all the neurons are, in these kind of lamina. That's how the brain's organised. So there's another brain, and that's actually flattened out. So you can see how parts of the kind of like brain correspond to this kind of flat sheet. The sheet's about 1 millimetre thick. That's what most of the information processing is going on in your brain. In the middle is mainly nerve fibres connecting the different neurons in these sheets. So different sheets handle different things. Like say, that's the visual cortex, where all your kind of optic nerve goes. Your eyes kind of feed into the primary visual cortex. That's the second visual cortex. This part deals with moving your hands. This part deals with your higher thoughts. All that's to do with vision, processing the location of objects and also recognising objects. That's processing sounds and music. So this is kind of like the basic organisation of what's called cerebral cortex. So you kind of have this kind of flat sheet, and these sheets are divided into patches, and each patch does a particular job. Now we're moving on. If you imagine that this sheet is kind of like organised in the columns. Each column going through the sheet is about 1/3 of a millimetre thick in diameter, kind of like a radial column. So this is actually a picture of the column. So imagine that's the kind of like the neural sheet. That's the kind of column going through it. Now each column contains about 10,000 neurons. 10,000 neurons, and your entire cortex, the cortex that deals with all these different functions, has the same basic organisation. There's another picture of how it's organised in terms of the nerve fibres and the cell distributions. And that's some of the neurons. It's kind of organised in 6 layers. And that kind of organisation is found throughout the brain, in the parts that handle, senses, vision, hearing, also higher thoughts. They have this basic architecture. Now, nature tends to use the same components again. It tends to use this kind of modular components. So these columns are also found in a mouse brain. So the columns in the human brain are also found in mouse brains, and they contain roughly the same number of neurons. Okay, so nature reuses the same components again and again. Now, I know how to sound, talk about brain science, it's almost the antithesis of spirituality. I'm going to show that actually this is going to lead to spiritual insights in a minute. So that's actual a photograph of a column that's kind of 1 millimetres going across the brain. That's actual all the neurons. And these actual neurons from different parts of the brain. This is kind of like a basic building block of the brain on a microscopic level. So lightning tour of brain science continues. Different neurons from different parts of the brain. Now, this kind of sheet where all this kind of processing goes on, visual processing, higher thoughts, auditory processing goes on, works together with central structures, and one of the main ones called a striatum. And this is divided into 3 sections. And the striatum is to do with sequencing temporal events, like movements, things that involve time. Say you have a succession of thoughts that involves time. That's what a striatum does. So the lower striatum is to do with movement. And that's modulated by a neurotransmitter called dopamine. If you lose your dopamine in the striatum, the lower striatum, then you can't move. That's Parkinson's disease. A slightly higher part of the striatum, called a nucleus accumbens, is fed by another dopamine pathway. And this is quite well known because it's the pathway of addiction. So all addictive drugs influence a part of the striatum called the nucleus accumbens, which links up with your emotion centres and also links up with your kind of higher thought centres, centres of thinking and planning. that all drugs, without exception, that cause addiction will actually influence the nucleoside bands through the dopamine projection from the ventral to mental area, it's called. Okay, to cut a long story short, the brain is stupendously complex. It really is. You can spend an entire lifetime talking about this. You can give a whole series of lectures about the brain. I want to show you there's something actually really simple about the brain, really incredibly simple about how the brain's organised. And in order to communicate this, I want to show you another diagram. So the brain is actually, even though it seems amazingly complex, there's an organisational principle behind the brain which makes it absolutely easy to understand. And I use a metaphor, so I'm going to introduce a metaphor to try and explain to you how the brain works, or relationships between parts of the brain. Okay, that's just another diagram of the striatum inside the brain, how it kind of fits together with all the rest. So it's all interconnected. That's a picture of a synapse. This is how brain cells get together. It's kind of like there's trillions of synapses, and this is how brain cells link up with one another. And that's how they talk to each other. That's actually an electron microscope picture of the synapse. Okay, so enough science, enough details. The organising principle, which actually explains all this complexity. The metaphor I use is Russian dolls. Russian dolls. Okay, those. I had fun drawing this. It's great. I went to Woolworths to buy these felt tip pens. I could say to a lady, "This is for a serious talk. I'm not going to go home to play these crayons and these felt tips. It's for a serious talk." And the lady at Woolworths is going, "Nah." Okay, Russian dolls. Okay. That's your standard set of Russian dolls. You know how they go. I mean, that doll fits to that doll, that doll fits to that doll, and they kind of fit together into one doll. Now, a variation of this idea of Russian dolls, if you imagine instead of one doll being, one slightly smaller doll being the big doll, if you imagine a slight variation on the theme of Russian dolls, if you imagine that each Russian doll contains many Russian dolls. Can you see that? So each Russian doll has many Russian dolls. Now, can you see the laser pointer there? It's kind of bright, isn't it? If you kind of look at the one Russian doll there, I kind of magnify it, and in that Russian doll, there's also many Russian dolls as well. And then I continue the process. In this Russian doll that's within that Russian doll, I kind of magnify that one there. So magnify it, and then that also contains it. And you take this process up to infinity. And there's a technical term for this relationship, and it's basically the idea is that the brain architecture is symmetrical, it's fractal, it's nested, and it's recursive. And that's a whole mouthful of words, but it's actually really, really simple. That's how the brain's organised. Symmetrical means that each Russian doll of the same size is roughly the same as the other Russian dolls. If you understand one Russian doll, you understand the other Russian doll. They look roughly similar. They're similar designed. They're not different objects. They look roughly the same. You can extrapolate from one to the other. Fractal means the smaller Russian dolls are also similar to the bigger Russian dolls. They look roughly the same, it's just smaller. So if you understand how one Russian doll is, you can shrink it and understand what the smaller ones are as well, and onwards. Nested means that simply that the dolls are contained within other dolls. They're kind of nested within each other. It's called nesting. And the idea of recursive means that this process of nesting just goes on. Russian dolls contain Russian dolls, and those Russian dolls contain Russian dolls. Okay. Get a bit tongue-tied saying Russian dolls now. Now, so much effort saying Russian dolls about 50 times, I need to take a drink of water to kind of lubricate myself again. Okay, let's go now. I guess Russian dolls 50 more times. So, this is how we explain the brain, because what does this have to do with the brain? Because this process of organisation where things are nested, where things are symmetrical, where things are kind of like recursive, is exactly how the brain's organised. But instead of Russian dolls, we have an organisation principle in the brain to do with the way brain structures are organised and the relationships between brain structures. And it's this. All neurons have this kind of branching structure. They're like trees. They take inputs like roots. They suck in like information, like the roots in on a tree suck in water. And they output information like a tree. kind of inflow into the cell body and outflow. These are different neurons with the three major structures in the brain who have the same organisation. Information going in, information coming out, and the kind of branching radial structure. And likewise for in the cerebellar cortex. But then also, these neurons are contained within columns. We talked about cortical columns earlier on. But then cortical columns also follow the same structure of information flowing in and information flowing out, the kind of tree structure. The roots of a tree taking in information, and the branches feeding out leaves and feeding out more information. And so on for all the brain. They have this organisation of inflow and outflow. And if we take this process further, then the cortical columns and these other structures which contain thousands, tens of thousands of neurons, these are organised into sheets, which we saw earlier, these patches. And again, the patches have this similar organisation in relation to other patches, this kind of inflow of information and outflow. So that's kind of branching tree structure throughout the brain. Now it's a slight simplification, but it's kind of like an organisation principle throughout the brain. When we take the entire brain, where each branch is not just a dendrite or one signal, each branch is a sensory modality, or your vision, or your body sense, or your hearing, and it all flows to a part of the brain called the hippocampus to do with memories. If you lose the hippocampus, you can't form new memories. And then correspondingly, that's the kind of like the cell body, your emotion centers. That's the kind of like the neuron cell body. And then it kind of flows outwards in a kind of branching structure. So it's fractal, like Russian dolls. Now we're not talking about Russian dolls, we're talking about trees. These trees contain little trees. The trees within the trees contain even smaller trees. And even smaller trees contain neurons. And some neuroscientists can actually take the process further within the neuron cell body. Trees within trees within trees within trees. Russian dolls within Russian dolls within Russian dolls. So this idea of recursive, symmetrical, self-similar organisation is a kind of organisation principle of the brain that really kind of simplifies and explains how the brain's organised. Now, the point I want to make, okay, this purpose, why I'm actually giving all this information about the brain, the point I want to make is that the mystical ideas we talked about earlier, of the cosmic tree, this idea of emanation, aggregation, the cosmic battle, and this idea of the Shiva Shakti, the male and female, is represented throughout the brain. Now obviously the cosmic tree we talked about earlier, this cosmic motif, the cosmic tree is represented throughout the brain. So not only is the microcosm as the macrocosm, but the microcosm and microcosm is as a macrocosm as well. It's a perfect fractal. So the cosmic tree is represented in a universal scale, in our lives, in a kind of, but also in our brains at all levels. This process of emanation and aggregation, we described earlier how one point becomes many, then the many become one. Well, this is to do with the human race. Earlier we described the brain. One brain cell becomes all the brain cells in the brain, but then all these brain cells become one brain. So again, this process of emanation from a point, one brain cell becomes all the brain cells, and all these brain cells become one mind. It's manifest in the brain as well. And also, signals are emanated from cell bodies and aggregated. Cosmic battle, kind of emanation, aggregation. So far from being kind of like the antithesis of spirituality, the brain is actually kind of like all these mystical ideas are actually represented in brain structure and brain process. Okay. Now, the further point I wanted to make is this. Now, earlier I kind of like talked about how consciousness, idealism, how everything's consciousness, and how consciousness is God. Now, this ties together with the brain. Obviously, there's a relationship between the brain and consciousness, obviously. Now the question is, what is that relationship? Materialist philosophers and neuroscience say that consciousness arises from the physical brain. But then mystics say that's not the case. They say that the physical universe, including the physical brain, is actually contained within consciousness of God. So what's the relationship between the brain and this idea that somehow consciousness can become God? Okay, let's go to the next point. Okay, sorry, I want to make a quite powerful point. Scientists and materialist philosophers do this concept called God in the gaps. Basically, in the time of atheism, and where people are kind of like hammering mystical and spiritual ideas, scientists and atheists have this idea of God in the gaps, which basically means that it's kind of like basically to put down religion, put down spiritualities. Basically, it's to denigrate spirituality. They're basically saying that God is in the gaps that science hasn't explained yet. So it's kind of pushing God out to the boundaries. So God isn't in the clouds. We've explored the clouds. God isn't in any mountain. We know how the universe works. God isn't anywhere. So like the materialist scientists saying, "Haha, you spiritual people, where's God? Ah, it's in the gaps." But there's one gap. There's one gap which science hasn't explained yet, and that gap has to do with the mind, brain, and consciousness. The point here is that the last gap that science has not explained, that philosophers and theologians cannot touch upon, is also the intersection where religion and spirituality meets philosophy, meets science. So this is the big gap that people don't really understand yet. The point here is that basically this gap is basically, when this gap is filled in, it's the return of the mystical. Now, materialist philosophers don't ask where is God, don't ask what is God, they don't even believe in God. But they do ask, what is consciousness? Now, it's such a simple thing, that the mystery of consciousness and the mystery of God are one and the same. Now, the mystery of God, that God is inside you, immanent, Christ within, Buddha within, Allah close to you, the jugular vein, etc. That God is inside you. But God also transcendent, transcends the physical universe. But then these are exactly the properties of consciousness. And what's close to you than your consciousness? What's more immanent than consciousness? But then also consciousness is transcendent. It transcends the physical brain. And this is what materialist scientists have been finding. They can't reduce consciousness to the brain. So it's such a simple assertion that the mystery of consciousness and the mystery of God are one and the same. Taken together with this idea that in the brain, the functioning of the brain reflects ancient mystical truths of the cosmic battle, emanation, aggregation on a cosmic scale. It's actually represented in brain anatomy and also brain function. That the final gap in human knowledge is actually the return of the sacred truth behind all world religion in the mystical traditions. So far from science being the antithesis of spirituality and mysticism, it's actually the destiny of science to become sacred. Materialist philosophers and materialist neuroscience scientists don't know what's going to hit them. They really have no idea what's in the pipeline. This final gap to do with the mind, brain, and consciousness is actually the return of the mystical, of the spiritual, of the transcendent, and it's inevitable. So we've kind of like talked about the brain, but then how does this allow us to understand why people have mystical experiences? So that's the point I was making about the brain and consciousness. Really is that the spiritual revelation of how the brain works and what's the nature of consciousness is the revelation of God, and it's the revelation of how the universe works. That's the point I was making. So why do people have mystical experiences?